Mark, thank you very much for your company. Now, you sit on the Defence Committee. There was a Russian rocket strike on a train station in eastern Ukraine in which at least 52 people have been killed, with 100 more injured yesterday. Now, in response, the Prime Minister there saying that the UK is sending a further 100 million quid worth of high-grade military equipment to Ukraine's armed forces. Do you reckon we're doing enough? Can we supply any more weaponry? Is there a little more wiggle room here?
Well, I think that the UK is doing all that it practically can. The Prime Minister is quite right. We should help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Ultimately, they're defending our freedom too. So we're providing more NLAWs, these superb anti-tank weapons. We're providing more Starstreak, anti-aircraft, anti-helicopter weapons. There is now talk we're going to provide them with Mastiff armoured vehicles. The best way to think of that, we use them in Afghanistan, it's like a super armoured truck, and it's designed particularly to protect the soldiers inside against IEDs and mine strikes. And if this war is going to switch to the east of Ukraine, to the Donbass, that's a very heavily mined area, or likely to be. So Mastiff would be a very practical vehicle. We're doing, I think, as much as we practically can. The question is, can we persuade our NATO allies to do likewise? I think there's a lot more that some of our NATO allies could do, particularly in terms of providing ex-Soviet equipment, like the Czechs have done, because most of the Ukrainian army is trained to use ex-Soviet kit. So where we can provide them with that, particularly things like tanks and armoured vehicles, that makes sense from their point of view, because they don't have to retrain to use it. You know, they'd be pretty much good to go as soon as they got their hands on it.
Yeah, I mean, the French, of course, have a presidential election this weekend. Do you actually think, Mark, that France have really shown themselves up here, and that what is the French narrative? And by the way, this is across the political spectrum in France, that actually they need to keep communications open with Putin. Do you think actually France have really let themselves and the NATO alliance down?
Well, I was critical of European politicians back in 2016 for interfering or trying to interfere in our EU referendum. So to be consistent, I'm not going to try and interfere in the French elections, you know, the first round of which I think is taking place tomorrow. But what I can say is that the Defence Committee, on which I serve, last week made a flying visit literally to Berlin and Warsaw to show solidarity with our NATO partners. And we saw, for instance, that the Germans are increasing their defence spending markedly. We've been criticising them for years for not spending 2% of GDP on defence, whereas France does. Now they've said they're going to do that. They've also announced a fund of 100 billion euros to re-equip the German armed forces, which, you know, in some cases have run down. So, you know, having criticised them for years for not having done that, I think, you know, it would be churlish not to say that the Germans have done the right thing militarily, although it would take a while for that money to flow through. I think that the bigger challenge there is energy security. Yeah. And the Germans have been rather caught short by the Russian invasion because, as the world knows, they're highly dependent on Russian gas. So the Germans are doing a lot to improve their military security, though that will take time, and that will obviously contribute to NATO. I think where we're all pressing them now is what are they doing to improve their energy security so they don't have to keep buying gas from Russia. And I think there are more questions to answer. But, you know, we have to hold Putin and his gang to account. So, you know, ultimately we need, you know, we're going to need some form of Nuremberg 2 rather than Nord Stream 2, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we also saw news this morning about the Chancellor Rishi Sunak's wife, Akshata Murthy, has now said that she will pay UK taxes on her overseas income. This follows criticism, for those just joining us, over her non-domicile status, where she wasn't required by law to pay. How do you think the Chancellor and his wife have actually handled this, Mark?
Well, I think there's a policy here that, politicians who stand for public office expect to be criticised by their opponents. At the end of the day, we live in a democracy. Russia is now effectively a police state. Thank God we don't live in a country like that. We should never, ever take living in a free country for granted, Darren. My father was a D-Day veteran. He drummed that into me when I was a young boy. I've never forgotten it. So, point one, as we were talking about Russia, we live in a democracy where we can have legitimate criticism. That said, I do think that we should focus on the politicians rather than on their partners. And I think in this situation, it would be better to play the ball rather than the man, or in this case is the woman.
That this has actually damaged the Tory brand.
Well, as I say, I can only answer as I believe, and there's been a media pylon here in the way that it works these days. But at the end of the day, this lady is not the Chancellor of the Exchequer. She's a successful businesswoman in her own right. She's not taking economic decisions. She's not setting tax rates. So I don't really think that the media should be going after her in the way that they are. But that's just my own view.
Yeah, Mark, can I ask you really quickly in a sentence there that Boris Johnson also said as a nation we're all getting a bit too fat. Now, there's been moves, I think, in a more sort of patrician Toryism to actually tell the nation that we need to get off our bums, basically, and move about a bit more. Are you worried about this sort of nanny statism, Mark?
Well, I'm not normally a great fan of what you could call the nanny state, Dan, but I'm on weak ground here because, I was in the gym yesterday and my PT was telling me I could do with losing a few pounds. So I'm probably not in the strongest possible position to give other people advice on that, if I'm honest to you.
Mark, thank you very much for your time today.